Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, this is the 77th day of Russian invasion and 9th year of Russian Federation's war against Ukraine. I'm Andriy Shevchenko, and on behalf of Ukraine Media Center to Inform, I'd like to welcome all journalists who tell the world about our fight for freedom. Today, we have gathered for special briefing of official representatives of Defense and Security Forces of Ukraine. First, I'd like to give the floor to Hanna, Maliar, Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your interest in our event. In the name of our briefing, we have announced that this war has been switching to a new phase, new stage, and today we'll discuss it. First of all, with people from all components of defense forces. The enemy has not managed to win in Ukraine in 2 days, nor 2 months, nor until 9th of May as they planned. And our defenders, men and women, heroically defend Ukraine. You all know it all too well, you all see it. This has been the 3rd month of this full-scale invasion, and during this time we can already draw some conclusions, and we can even summarize some results. So the war has switched to its 2nd stage, and it's the defense of Kyiv which has become the turning point. What can we analyze, what can we summarize over this period of time? The enemy set a key task for themselves in 3 days or in a week or maximum 2 weeks to take the capital city of Ukraine, and in that way to take full control of our country. Within that first period or the first phase of this war, the enemy failed to implement those tasks, to achieve those goals. And in that stage, in that first stage of the war, when their goal was taking Kyiv, the enemy was using their elite troops, and we are talking about large numbers of those. There were about 24 battalion tactical groups. First of all, those were units of the Russian Special Operation Forces, assault troopers and Marines. And during that first period, first phase, the enemy was using the tactics of dominating in terms of both numbers of personnel and quantity of weapons, and their bet was on the elite nature and professionalism of their units. In that first stage of the war, huge number of enemy's troops was concentrated around Kyiv and Kyiv Oblast. And the characteristic feature for that first stage was huge losses incurred by the enemy in terms of both personnel and weapons and equipment. During that first phase of the war, Ukrainian armed forces made a blow to the enemy, and the first phase ended with the victory of Ukrainian armed forces, in that the enemy failed to implement their key tasks, achieve their key goals. After the heroic defense of Kyiv and Kyiv province, Kyiv Oblast, the war has actually turned into a different phase, because now the enemy has to set new goals and to apply different tactics and different strategy in their war against Ukraine. Russia has practically been defeated strategically, as we just discussed, because it has failed to achieve any of its goals. At the same time, there is a very difficult and long stage of that fight awaiting us until the full liberation of our territories and their internationally recognized borders, because Russia still has a lot of resources, a lot of equipment, and they're able to mobilize people to their troops, which can be done in the nearest weeks. Today we would like to inform you in detail about what has already happened during this period of time and what are the trends that will define future developments. over these more than 70 days of war, there have been tectonic changes. Since the moment of escalation on the 24th of February, we were preparing to defend our country not just for 2 weeks, not just until the 9th of May, but until our absolute victory. We believed in our army, so we understood that this would be a long war. We realized our weaknesses. In particular, Russia has much higher amounts of resources. That's obvious due to the reserves of mostly Soviet weapons, and they can afford a long and intense war. So immediately the work was started to change the philosophy of international assistance and increasing volumes of that assistance. Most importantly, Ukraine started receiving modern heavy weapons of Western models. And basically, the attitude, the standing of the West that we see now is like second front against the Russian Federation. What are the results we have achieved? First of all, the front line, in addition to javelins and stingers, there have already been US-made 155mm howitzers, and Western armored vehicles continue to arrive as well as other weapons. 3 months ago, it was considered impossible. Those are the results of work done jointly by the President of Ukraine, Office of the President, Ministry of Defense, our diplomats, and all those who support our efforts. We have been working on increasing and speeding up the pace of that assistance because the lives of our defenders, our military, depend on that. Probably you've all been watching news, and you all know that on the 26th of April on Ramstein Bay there was a historical meeting where leaders of defense ministries, defense agencies of more than 40 countries established new goal for the free world, not to stop Kremlin, but to win over it. Second, in the US, the law on Lend-Lease has already been signed, and draft law has been under consideration about the volumes of that assistance, and we have been receiving support from European Union countries, from Canada and other countries on bilateral level. So we enter this new stage of the war against the background of changes in the global attitude towards resistance against Russia. Even with that huge pressure, with those rocket strikes from Russia, Russia is entering a situation where they cannot win in that war of resources. At the same time, we have to understand that until we get Western weapons in the amount sufficient to support our potential and our advantage, it will take some time because it's about certain procedures. So all of us have to live through several very difficult weeks and maybe months. In addition to external changes, we have been actively transforming the defense and security sector internally. In particular, it's not a top secret that at the beginning of that active phase, the first phase of the war, there were known difficulties with supplies of individual protective gear. We understood that, and we were not hiding that situation because it was about the fact that concurrently hundreds of thousands of citizens were mobilized. Also, literally in 1 week, more than 100,000 territorial defense troops were deployed. In the first weeks, huge amounts of assistance were provided by volunteers, and we express our huge gratitude to them for doing that. They have been very mobile and they satisfied our most urgent needs. But now, in the third month of this war, situation has changed, and the Ministry of Defense understand that we'll have to provide all the necessities for about 1 million people: regular armed forces, territorial defense, mobilized people, reserve corps, reserves, and needs of other components of defense and security sector. So, in line with the government's instructions, we bet strategically on the development of Ukrainian production. It's about bulletproof vests and helmets, as well as uniforms and food boxes. Our manufacturers who comply with quality requirements have already had orders till the end of this year, and there is a clear schedule of supplies for those products. Also, in order to quickly satisfy the needs of Ministry of Defense, the required goods are important, and the Ministry is looking for international technical assistance. I'm not to quote everything, but I'll quote several numbers for you to understand. For example, since the 1st of May until the 10th of May, to provide the units of Ukrainian armed forces, we have received more than 35,000 bulletproof vests, more than 46,000 of uniforms, sets of uniforms, more than 30,000 of helmets. That is to say, in one day, on the 9th of May, under international agreement, the Ministry of Defense has received 2,300 of helmets, and on 10th of May, 5,000 more helmets. There are certain amounts cargo still in transit, and they have still not been recorded, accounted for, so we are not talking about those. The Ministry of Defense provide those items in centralized way to logistical forces of Ukrainian armed forces, and then our command of our army distribute them. They see the general picture and they identify the priorities. The same applies to distribution of weapons. We monitor on a daily basis the reserves, the inventory that we can dispose of. For a certain time, we have been maintaining a situation where every day for protective gear, for example, we have to have reserve for 2 brigades, and every day these amounts will increase. If you bring together all those bulletproof vests received by Ukrainian army since the 24th of February, then according to the yesterday's data, 56% of those have been provided through various contracts by the Ministry of Defense, and 44% through various types of charitable assistance, charitable aid, and we'll be quickly increasing the percentage provided by the Ministry of Defense here, including the internal domestic production, which I already mentioned today. About helmets, the balance there is different. Most of them, 70%, come from various types of humanitarian support. To quickly deploy quality production of helmets, we have smaller capacity here, so still there will be dominating supplies from abroad in various formats. Generally, I have to say that due to explosive increase in the amount of needs for our defense, there have been certain difficulties, but those are growth problems, and we have been successfully overcoming those. Thank you for attention. Oleksiy Hromov, Brigadier General, Deputy Head of the main Operational Department, Deputy Chief of Operations of the General Staff of Ukrainian Armed Forces. You're welcome. Good afternoon. Dear audience, Ukrainian armed forces, jointly with other components of defense forces, have by now stopped and have been resisting the wide-scale offensive of Russian armed forces. Their armed forces were overwhelming ours 10 times, with a factor of 10, not only in terms of personnel, but also in terms of weapons and military equipment. It became possible due to timely implementation of measures by us to respond to a critical increase in military threat from Russia, as well as our active, flexible maneuvering disease. So we did our crisis planning for use of Ukrainian armed forces jointly with other components of defense forces. And also we implemented measures to replenish reserve of missiles, ordnance, and technical means and military equipment. Under the guise of military exercise, we deployed additional numbers of troops in the various directions where we saw the threat. Deployment, creation of the command and control system. We regrouped the forces and means of air defense and aviation, and also in one day before the military aggression, we relocated our aviation to field airfields. Due to implementation of those measures and mobilization of the Ukrainian people, we broke enemy's plans to quickly siege Kyiv, to take Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, Odessa, Chernihiv, Sumy, and we forced the enemy to drop their aggressive plans and to focus their efforts on one direction. By now, the most intense combat action takes place in Liman area. Around Kharkiv, the enemy, after a failed attempt to siege the city, turned to defense. After their failure in the Izum area, the enemy switched to defense and now have been trying to resist and move their forces to Luhansk direction. As a result of our active action to liberate territories in Kherson and Melitopol direction, the enemy has switched to defense and now runs defensive action. In Ukrainian armed forces, there has been heroic personnel, 36 separate Marine Brigade, 24th, 93rd, 92nd Brigades of ground forces, 79th, 80th, and 95th paratrooper forces, as well as other military units of armed forces of Ukraine supported by territorial defense brigades. Currently, there are still is fire effect by the enemy against our troops, use of aviation, artillery, and multiple launch rocket systems by the enemy. First of all, it's about Severodonetsk, Popasna, and Kurakhove directions. There is still blocking of our units and fire effect against our units around Azovstal steel factory in Mariupol. Communication with defense forces is in place, who heroically maintain their positions. Currently, an operation to unblock those units would take significant efforts and significant numbers of personnel, of troops, since units of Ukrainian armed forces are 150 to 200 kilometers from Mariupol. Also, the enemy has created a wide system of fortifications and defense lines, which would result in significant losses for our troops. I have to emphasize that planning and implementation of any operations is not to be discussed in public. Ukrainian armed forces have brought ammunition, communication means, and medicines to Mariupol more than once. Such supplies were possible until information was disseminated about provision of such assistance. As a result, the enemy implemented measures to strengthen their air defense, which made it more difficult for us to carry out such actions and resulted in losses of personnel and helicopters who were evacuating our wounded soldiers. Now the enemy has been using tactics of so-called hidden offensive in east of Ukraine, has been trying to siege and defeat our joint forces. At the same time, we have success in Kharkiv area, where we gradually push away the enemy and liberate our towns and villages. There is still a threat that the enemy would land their troops in Black Sea area of operations. In Black Sea and Sea of Azov, there are still battleships and submarines of the enemy who support their ground forces acting in coast areas and make high-precision weapon strikes against facilities deep in our territory. The enemy continues rocket and missile strikes from seaborne and airborne rockets, including aviation, against military facilities and critical infrastructure, industry, transport networks, recently also railway facilities, trying to stop increasing the number of our troops and break the logistics of our troops in the east of Ukraine. The enemy's losses since the beginning of so-called special operations have already amounted to about 20% of personnel and up to 60% of key types of equipment and weapons. But even if the enemy achieves their goal of that second stage of so-called special operation, which is occupation of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts in their administrative borders, then most probably the enemy will not be satisfied. It will just create preconditions for them to expand their aggression. I will finish my statement by saying that even with all those difficulties and based on our existing resources, Ukrainian armed forces, jointly with other components of defense forces, have been implementing their assignments to defense Ukraine. We have rearranged our groups in time, created proper operational arrangements, and have started fighting against overwhelming troops of the enemy. Whatever difficult it is, we continue implementing our constitutional duties. Thank you for attention. Oleksiy Nadtochiy, Head of Operations of the main Directorate of the National Guard of Ukraine. Good afternoon, everybody. I will tell you about the participation of the National Guard of Ukraine in repelling the military aggression and how the National Guard implements its responsibilities established by the law of Ukrainian National Guard. Troops and forces of the National Guard, which have been under operational command of commanders of joint forces of Ukrainian armed forces, continue implementation of its special tasks within the defense forces and participate in implementation of stabilization tasks and territorial defense. And in that way, the National Guard continues its involvement in the defense operation in Donetsk, Slobozhanщина, Southern Bug, areas and southern eastern part of Tavria area of operations. National Guard continues covering the state border of Ukraine with the Republic of Belarus and strengthening defense lines in the western part of Ukraine, as well as engagement in stabilization operations. The combat tasks are implemented by units of the National Guard of Ukraine. They have been implemented, and currently we have been maintaining our positions. We have been rearranging and relocating certain troops, replenishing for our losses, replenishing our personnel, and replenishing our material resources. About the territorial defense, the National Guard of Ukraine, and I'd like to especially cover Mariupol, their National Guard participates in the defense of Mariupol. That's personnel from the Eastern Territorial Unit, Southern and Central Territorial units of the National Guard, and they implement their task being completely surrendered by the enemy on the tactical level. Communications are unstable. We have communications, but those are unstable. The area is defended through full-run defense, and situation is still difficult in that area of operations. About the territorial defense, National Guard forces continue implementation of tasks to defend and protect important facilities of the national importance, protection of the defense of the regional and local critical facilities, critical infrastructure facilities as established by decisions of oblast military administrations or councils, fighting against illegal military formations by doing reconnaissance, blocking and isolation activities. Support for the martial law by participation in implementation of tasks established by law, protection of the diplomatic facilities and consular facilities of foreign states, interacting with the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine. We have evacuated the suspects who have been kept in custody. Since the very first days of the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation troops in Ukraine, the National Guard, interacting with other military units and law enforcement agencies, as well as territorial military administrations, has been implementing a range of law enforcement tasks in towns and villages of Ukraine, including those which have been already liberated from Russian occupation. So to maintain permanent control over movement of transport and people on roads, bridges, entries and exits of towns and villages, National Guard forces, both independently and jointly with the National Defense and Territorial Defense Forces, have been involved in implementing assignments in 170 checkpoints in Ukraine, including 17 checkpoints in the city of Kyiv. To monitor around the clock the public security and order in certain towns and villages, we have established more than 50 monitoring outposts. We have been protecting more than 600 facilities, first of all, critical infrastructure facilities, in order to prevent any marauder activities and administrative or criminal offenses. We have been patrolling and support of curfew in those areas, and there are more than about 2,500 servicemen from the National Guard, about 70 cars and trucks, and 70 dog experts with their dogs participating in those activities. Over this period of time, we have captured and transferred to law enforcement about 4,000 people, including 731 persons suspects in criminal offenses, including 230 suspects about sabotage activities. We have taken 52 firearms, about 3,000 cartridges, 40 grenades, one improvised explosive device. Unfortunately, the National Guard has incurred losses in personnel including 697 wounded and 501 servicemen who died. That's it. Thank you for attention. Thank you. Now the Border Protection Service of Ukraine, Leonid Baran, head of the Border Protection Department in the administration of the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine. Thank you. Dear colleagues, good afternoon, everybody. The State Border Guard Service of Ukraine, which I have the honor to represent here, all our servicemen, since the very beginning of this aggression and until today, continue defending Ukraine jointly with other defense force components. And we continue ensuring security in those parts of the state border where the situation is still difficult. I have to say that the border guard units participate in resisting that aggression according to the general framework of the general staff, and most of them have been under command of the joint military command. The enemy still continues attempts to move deeper into Ukraine in many areas. They continue their artillery shelling and bombing of our units' positions. The most intense situation is there, as you know, in Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, where the enemy has been running assault actions trying to take full control over those territories. There, jointly with other forces, with joint forces, with National Guard, our border guard people from Kharkiv, Luhansk and Kramatorsk border guard units have been involved. In the heroic defense forces of the city of Mariupol, in Azovstal steel factory, there are border guard guards of Donetsk border guard units and Mariupol Sea border protection unit. About situation in certain parts of the border. On the border with the Republic of Belarus, there have been no significant changes in the situation. Units of the Belarusian armed forces continue implementing their assignments, strengthening the protection of border with Ukraine. At the same time, taking into account information about possible possible arrival of Belarusian special operation forces. This is a situation widely disseminated badly pushed by Belarusian authorities themselves. We take that situation into account and respectively we take necessary measures to respond to those threats. There is still a tense situation on the border with Moldova, first of all in its Transnistrian segment. We cannot exclude that, like the territory of Belarus, that territory, that segment can also be used by the enemy for further escalation. Still on the border of Belarus, as well in that Transnistrian area, jointly with other Ukrainian defense forces, we make all necessary steps to increase protection of those areas and take into account all information that may affect the protection of Ukrainian state border. I have to add that all checkpoints on Transnistrian segment of borders with Moldova and on borders with Belarus and Russia, according to the government decisions, have been closed. There, Ukrainian border guards do not pass citizens on those checkpoints. At the same time, there are facts when the Ukrainian citizens, especially in Volhynia area, return to Ukraine, and in accordance with constitutional requirements, we accept those citizens and we execute proper formalities for them. As already said, the State Border Guard Service within Kyiv, Chernihiv and Sumy Oblast, within the framework of renewing control, restoring resumption of control over the state border, we have reached the respective areas of responsibilities. Basically, we have resumed control over the state border over 1,200 kilometers. Two-thirds of them are about border with Russia. Still, there is a danger. And for that reason, there is no classical border protection the way we had it before the aggression, of course. Now we continue implementation of steps to check all the locations neighboring the border. We establish monitoring outposts and other locations for our service. Possible threats, possible dangers include minefields, sabotage groups, and shelling from the neighboring territory. neighboring countries' territory. In particular, in the recent days, there has been increasing shelling of Ukrainian territory and border guards posts, not only using artillery, but also by aviation, making aviation strikes from Russian territory. To ensure safety and security on the border, we increase and implement new restrictions. Now such restrictions have been implemented in Sumy Oblast, Chernihiv Oblast, and in Kyiv Oblast. In particular, until the end of the martial law in controlled border areas, it has been prohibited for any civilians to move in the locations in the territories directly adjacent to the state border, other than territories of towns and villages located in those territories. About the borders with the EU countries and Moldova, we see increasing traffic of people and cars there. Since the 24th of February, there has been 6,400,000 people who cross the border in both directions, including 4,300,000 people who left Ukraine. Currently, we see a trend of increasing traffic of Ukrainian citizens, more people coming to Ukraine than leaving Ukraine. It's worth reminding that Ukrainian citizens can leave the border to leave Ukraine using their domestic passports. That's the provision which was implemented, but we have to remind you that in some situations when you're abroad you may need your travel passport, and such awareness campaign is carried out for our compatriots, that they should know it. There are still some cases where people try to trespass the state border outside of the checkpoints. Those Ukrainian citizens who want to avoid mobilization, and they are subject to conscription. There are almost 1,300 people, two-thirds of them caught outside of checkpoints. At the end, I would like to say that those steps that the State Border Protection Border Guard Service of Ukraine has been implementing within the framework of resistance, repelling of the military aggression and protecting the state border, are implemented by thousands of people in our service. Since the very first minutes of Russian invasion, our servicemen have been acting in a heroic way. They have shown that they are not scared, they do not fear the enemy. 277 of our servicemen have been decorated with state awards, including 57 people posthumously. And 2 border guard servicemen have received this title of the hero of Ukraine posthumously. Eternal glory to our heroes and eternal memory to those defenders of Ukraine who have died. Thank you, everybody, for attention. Now, the National Police of Ukraine, Oleksiy Serheyev, head of the Organizational and Analytical Support and Coordination Department of the National Police of Ukraine. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. The entities and units of the National Police, since the very first day of the war, jointly with other components of defense and security forces, have been implementing measures to support the national security, to resist the military aggression of the Russian Federation, to help citizens of Ukraine. We take active part, direct part in national resistance, organization of territorial defense, and implementation of assignments of martial law. In particular, such tasks include police operations on checkpoints, control over exits and entries in towns and villages in order to catch sabotage groups, as well as citizens who collaborate with the enemy. Now, the National Police of Ukraine, jointly with Armed Forces, military, police, territorial defense, and National Guard, has been working in 625 checkpoints. Every day, round the clock, there have been more than 2,000 police officers there. IT professionals of the police have developed checkpoint information system. There has been data on more than 2.2 million of people who have participated in illegal armed formations, members of sabotage groups, collaborators with the enemy, and other persons. We check more than 1,000 suspicious persons every day, and we find at least 10 persons involved or possibly involved in sabotage and reconnaissance activities, and we pass them to the security service of Ukraine. Also, in addition to operating checkpoints, we have created special teams which include people from the criminal police and special forces who work every day to identify and capture members of sabotage and reconnaissance groups. Since the 24th of February, police has found 88 of such groups, which included 757 people who have been passed for further investigation to security services Ukraine. In particular, on the 28th of April in Shevchenkivsky district of the city of Kyiv, we captured 2 residents of Kyiv who took pictures of Artem production plant on their smartphones and sent photos to Russian numbers. That factory has had a target of missile strike. Also in Zaporizhia, Luhansk and Kharkiv Oblast, our police officers have been actively participated in evacuating people from combat action. They provide assistance to people in gathering points and accompanying them over green corridors. In February and March, it was also done in Kyiv, Sumy and Chernihiv Oblast by police officers. On the total, police officers have provided assistance and protection during evacuation to more than 1.5 million citizens. During evacuation, there have been cases where the occupiers, invaders have shelled evacuation convoys. During this time, there has already been 74 criminal proceedings initiated. As a result of 45 cases of shelling of convoys and civilians, 33 citizens died, including 5 children. I have to say that since the very beginning, the very first day of the war, we tried to arrange permanent operations of 102 hotline and other channels of communication for citizens for their communication with the national police. Say, for the very first day, there have been more than 200 police officers on the 102 hotline, while in peaceful time there were 170 operators. We have redirected calls from Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast to safe areas in western Ukraine. We have established 2 workstations in basements, in shelters, to make it safe for 102 hotline operators during air alerts. All these measures allowed us to maintain effective operation of 102, but also to increase the capacity of that service. And overall, this time we have received almost 2 million messages from citizens, mostly of advisory nature and requests for help. Currently, in the occupied territories of Kyiv, Sumy and Chernihiv Oblast, we have fully resumed operations of the national police. We receive messages using 102 hotline and our duty units. There are sufficient numbers of police team and investigative teams visiting locations on site. There have been 5 territorial units in Bucha region, Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanska, Makarov, and Kapitanka, who were under occupation, as well as 3 police units in Vyzhgorod district, in Chernohiv, Luhankiv, and Slavutich. 2 police station locations were completely destroyed in Borodyanka and Makarov. All others have been partially damaged. We have resumed operations of police units, and yesterday there was a significant day when the head of national police opened a new building of the national police in city of Borodyanka, town of Borodyanka. Now we can arrange full-scale operations of our units and to receive messages, reports from citizens. Thank you for attention. Please get back to the podium. Now we have time for several questions from journalists. If you have a question, please introduce yourself. Let's start from second row, from Ukrinform. Good afternoon, I'm Vitaly Golod from Ukrinform. My question is about the situation with Belarus and Transnistria. Is there still a threat of an offensive from those countries? Because for a long time we were waiting for that. My second question is about Crimea. A threat of missiles, rocket strikes from Crimea. How serious that threat is? Do you have information about the number of rockets concentrated in Crimea and whether there are nuclear weapons there? Well, Belarus and Moldova. About your first question, the threat of conflict from Belarusian side and from Moldovan side. Currently, the General Staff has been considering various scenarios of enemy's actions, even though, based on the situation from the Republic of Moldova and from the Republic of Belarus, at the moment the enemy does not carry out any active action, but just some demonstrations. Irrespective of that, we are ready for any developments, any and every sort of developments. We have developed several plans. As I mentioned, everything will be good. We'll win. Crimea and rockets. About Crimea, about weapons the enemy has in Crimea, as I already emphasized in my statement, the enemy still does not leave us alone, making strikes with airborne rockets and seaborne rockets, both from Russia and from the Black Sea. The enemy has air carriers for such rockets, as well as sea carriers. That said, we cannot exclude that there may be nuclear weapons in Crimea, but at the moment we don't have such data. Thank you. You're welcome.
My question is about the situation in Mariupol and Azovstal factory. Do you have a negotiation with the United Nations, maybe, or Red Cross to find a safe exit for the people inside? And what about the civilian in Azovstal? Do you find a way to mobilization them outside the hot region or not?
Maybe I'll add to this question, has there been any response from the Russian side for all those proposals to create conditions for evacuation, including evacuation of civilians? At the moment, there is no full-fledged information, no new quality information about any positive consent from the Russian Federation to resolve issues for Mariupol. That's the information I have at the moment. That's it. Thank you. Also, there was a question about a response from international organizations, a response to Ukrainian appeals. Do we have any news there about Mariupol? Oh, then let's go on.
Would you like to follow up? No? One moment. Please use your mic. І я прошу взяти наушники, якщо є необхідність. One moment. We want to make sure that everyone understands. Thank you. Звичайно, зараз повторю запитання, що можливо. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm so sorry I couldn't speak Ukrainian. Forgive me. My question specific is what the situation in Mariupol. Do you find a safe exit for the civilization, the civilized people there or not? Civilian people there or not?
About situation in Mariupol, I'd like to repeat again that currently I don't have any information about any positive consent from Russia for evacuation of our civilian population from Mariupol area. About your previous question, I can give you some facts, provide some facts about missile and aviation strikes against our territory. Say, by 6 a.m. today, since the beginning of full-scale military aggression, Russian armed forces have carried out 487 rocket strikes from the territory of Russia and the Republic of Belarus, and there have been 788 cruise missiles and ballistic missiles launched. Those are short-range Iskander, 213 missiles, Tochka-U, 60 missiles, 61 Tochka-U missile, seaborne cruise missiles and airborne missiles, 235 cruise missiles. The enemy has carried out 4,917 aviation tasks. During the May Russian armed forces during the May, Russian armed forces made 49 rocket strikes from territory of Russia. They launched 74 cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, 4 Iskander missiles and 8 Nadtochiy missiles, and 2 cruise missiles, seaborne and airborne, 459 aviation strikes. As we already said, the key goals, the key targets for the enemy were transport infrastructure facilities in southern and eastern regions of Ukraine, and many times strikes were also made against other critical infrastructure facilities of socially important sites, socially important targets. If you draw an analogy against April, similar first 10 days of April, in the first 10 days of April, the enemy made 36 rocket strikes from Russian territory and launched 73 cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. There were also 640 aviation strikes. Compared with the previous period, currently we see some increase in the number of cruise missiles launched. At the same time, there has been a higher share of old, outdated, less high-tech models like Nadtochiy tactical missiles and X and Bastion class rockets. Also, there has been 30% less fewer of aviation strikes. Thank you. I can add by saying that about Mariupol, we know that now there are now brave defenders from various units of various defense and security forces of Ukraine. If you have anything to add about Mariupol, you're welcome. Indeed, currently the defense of Mariupol is carried out by all defense forces, including units of Border Guard Service, the Territorial Defense of Mariupol, units of the National Police, and the National Guard. If I haven't and the Ukrainian Armed Forces, yes, and of course the Ukrainian Armed Forces. The matter is that territorial defense is part of Ukrainian Armed Forces. So when we say units of territorial defense of Mariupol, we mean those are in the armed forces. There was a question about a response from international community about assistance. Currently, using mediation by the United Nations, due to Ukrainian defenders, all units, and the presidential office, we managed to evacuate civilians from Azov steel factory. I mean women, children, and older people. And we believe that at the moment there has been this obvious response and support from international community in those processes. About the question of unblocking, if you were to have any opportunity to unblock Mariupol in a military way, trust me, it would be used by Ukrainian leadership. Currently, Ukrainian armed forces are doing everything possible to make it possible, to do it as soon as possible. But, you know, as we already emphasized today, military actions and military plans cannot be discussed in public. Thank you. If you'd like to add something, well, let's go on next question. You're welcome. I'm Oleksiy from Army Info News Agency. My question is about monetary provisions for the military. So, how much funds have been transferred by the Ministry of Defense for salaries of the military? Because since the beginning of the war, those salaries have largely increased. What's the situation at the moment? Thank you. Thank you for your question. Indeed, this is a very important question. Since the beginning of this war, since the 24th of February, we have increased the financial support for all the military. Salaries have increased by 30,000 hryvnias a month if there's no combat action, and 100,000 hryvnias per month for those servicemen who are directly engaged in combat action. So if you calculate it dividing by days, then the non-combat day during wartime is like 1,000 hryvnias, and the day of combat action is 3,000 hryvnias per day. How do we pay that money? We get the data about how many days of combat action have been covered. We get the data from the Ukrainian armed forces, and they in turn receive that information from military units, from commanders of military units. Then the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine transfers that money, those funds, to military units, and those military units pay to the servicemen. Say in May, as of 10th of May, the Military of Defense transferred 34.5 billion of hryvnias, and that's for payments based on 30,000 hryvnias a month. Then by the 20th of May, we'll pay 34 billion more to military units, and that money will be for combat payouts and various other payouts. In addition, indeed, during the first week, there were some problems. We got some inquiries, including I personally received those inquiries on social media, and we investigated in particular each particular case why some servicemen did not receive those payments. We received all those messages, and in each particular issue was resolved. But usually, based on our statistics, why did it happen? Usually it happened because some commander did not properly document something, or there were some problems with calculating, with providing evidence that there have been so many combat days. But by now, all those issues have been resolved, and currently this system has already been established, and everything works fine. Thank you for your question. You're welcome.
Joe Jiaxing with CGTN English Service. I'd like to propose the question to Madame Maliar, if my pronunciation is right. So we know President Zelensky yesterday in a video speech to the Parliament of Malta said that the country is still providing the options, and they have the negotiations with Russia to try to rescue those defenders at the Azovstal plant. But Russia has not yet agree to any of many options provided by Ukrainian side. Could you please specify what are those options on the table? And you're also talking about unblocking Mariupol, and President Zelensky also said that the country still needs more weapons and amount of it. And could you just brief on that? What might be the next step? And also, we know in addition to Ukrainian National Guards and civilians inside the plant, our reports are also talking about some foreign mercenaries. Do you have some details about this? Thanks so much.
Thank you for your questions. I understand how important they are and how painful it is not only for Ukraine but globally. But with regard to information about the situation in Mariupol, it's very sensitive information, and each and every word will be used, first of all, by the enemy. In particular, there was some information published back then about some assistance provided to about weapons and other means. And then the enemy made some steps, and we ran into very serious problems. We have to understand that any discussion of this topic, even though there is a big demand for such information, but it's very dangerous for operation itself. So any information about that operation and everything around it is reasonably secret information. So if armed forces could add anything, then maybe their people will add something. But, for you to understand that until the completion of the military operation, and the military operation has not completed theirs yet, until completion of that operation, military agencies and Ministry of Defense and civil agency cannot discuss it in public. Next question. Zelenska from Rada TV channel. My question is for Oleksiy. Is mobilization is continuing to the National Guard, and do you have sufficient numbers of personnel to implement your assignments? And have you fully resumed protection of Chernobyl nuclear power plant? And the question for the National Police: how many sabotage group members and collaborationists have been captured by today since the beginning of full-scale invasion? Thank you. Oleksiy Nadtochiy. Thank you. I can tell you that after the enemy left the territory of Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the personnel of the 1st Separate Battalion for the guarding of the nuclear power plant partially returned to their responsibilities. The commander of the National Guard allocated some reserves of personnel and forces to strengthen that protection, that guard. We sent demining teams there, demining teams from the National Guard and the State Border Protection Service, because I can tell you that currently more than 1,500 of explosive items have been found in the first 5 days of demining operations there around nuclear power plants. We have fully resumed the guarding and strengthened the guarding of nuclear power plant. Now about our mobilization resources. Currently the National Guard has received about 30,000 personnel. We have created military units and took control of facilities as defined by the resolution by the Cabinet of Ministers. But this process still continues. For example, during this week, we have received 350 conscripts and 30 equipment units for our military units. And I can tell you that our mobilization resources of the National Guard have been used only to take control of important national facilities established by the resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers. Oleksiy Serheyev, thank you. Since the very first day of this war, the main intelligence directorate, the security service of Ukraine, the national police were taking measures to counteract sabotage and reconnaissance groups, their identification and capturing. To that end, we have engaged every day operatives and special forces directly engaged in capturing mostly armed people. Since the beginning of this war, we have identified 88 sabotage groups. We have captured 850 people involved in sabotage activities, including 676 people whom we passed to the security service of Ukraine. Also, investigators of the National Police initiated 484 criminal cases, criminal proceedings for collaborationist activities. We have already notified of suspicion 72 people. Next question. I'm Maria Paskov from Espresso. Previously, a member of City Council of Mariupol announced some chemical attack for the 11th of May. Can you confirm it? Do you have any information? I mean, the armed forces, do you have any information? Also, there was some information that Russia has achieved the administrative boundary of Luhansk Oblast. That's information from the enemy's Ministry of Defense. Do you have that information? And also, U.S. intelligence said that in the nearest months may become unpredictable and there may be some escalation. How the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine treats that information and the general staff? I will start with your last question. Probable next step to the enemy, we believe that they may try to take control of Odessa, Mykolaiv and part of Zaporizhia Oblast to create some ground corridor to Transnistrian region of the Republic of Moldova. And taking territory of central of Ukraine, taking Kyiv, and staging some elections to legislative and executive authorities to bring pro-Russian forces and creation of new unit to include in Russia. In that way, the enemy will try to achieve their strategic political goal. But that's what their ideas are, and we are countering those ideas. We are resisting it. About the chemical attack against Mariupol. Unfortunately, if some weapons are manufactured, such weapons will be used at some point in time. Currently, there hasn't been any 100% confirmation of the use of chemical weapons against our defenders, but the enemy is cruel. So, well, administrative boundary of Luhansk Oblast, I cannot confirm your statement. You know, about briefings by Russian armed forces, often we monitor them and we see what is true, what our truth is against our fakes. You know, currently our armed forces, our military units are defending the lines of defense. The situation has not changed against the last day, except for liberation of some towns and villages in Kharkiv Oblast. Thank you. Next question.
One moment.
Oh?
Let's make sure we have translation.
Okay. I'm sorry. Good afternoon. I'm
One moment. There was another question which wasn't answered, and then we'll get back to you. My fault.
Було запитання, так?
There was a question, as far as I understand, about possible developments in terms of American, U.S. assessments and how do we treat those. Well, Putin now has been using the tactics aimed at the creation of that image of an unpredictable politician. So, indeed, these are tactics of war. Putin is doing everything to make it more difficult to respond to his actions, to make it more difficult to prepare any response. So, you know, to predict what will be his next step, it's very difficult. So, we consider all possible scenarios, all possible developments, and we consider all risks. Most probably, psychologically, mentally, he is ready for escalation, including the use of chemical weapons, and such scenarios are also considered. From the short phase, which I mentioned today, this war has turned into a long phase, because this short phase, trying to take Kyiv, has failed. So in any situation, in any case, there is a long fight for us, and finally there will be victory. Thank you for this important addition, and thank you for being careful about attentive.
And Chief of Magazine Waterways and Navigation from Czech Republic, Tomáš Kolářík. And I would like to ask about the situation on the Dnieper River area, as you partially answered. How is situation between Zaporozhye and Mykolaiv on the front line, and also was there any actions on the Dnieper River to cross the river or to attack your forces from this area? And also, I would like to ask situation about seaports, as they were blocked. Is there any development in to unblock the seaports and to allow transport of the grain and other materials out of the country? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Currently, in Zaporizhia and Mykolaiv Oblast, Ukrainian units of armed forces with other components of defense forces continue implementing those assignments. There have been no sharp changes in the situation in those regions. With regard to some local questions, as I already emphasized, this is not the right time to discuss some issues of planning and implementation of our tasks. About seaports being blocked, I'd like to draw your attention to the situation around Zminy, Snake Island. This is our territory, the territory of Ukraine, which is also administratively part of Ukraine, like any temporarily occupied territory. And currently, the Snake Island, Zminy Island, is also one of the key parts of our territory. And control of that island and regaining control of that Snake Island, Mina Island, will enable us to resist the enemy who is blocking Odessa port hub, and it's about advantage in Odessa, in the Black Sea region. Thank you. And I will probably add something by saying that blocking of Ukrainian ports is probably outside of the competence of just defense and security forces. We have reasons to believe that Russia has been purposely attacking and blocking the infrastructure that Ukraine needs for exports, and this is a real threat for global food security, food safety. Next question.
La Repubblica Italian newspaper. About the equipment and the armament systems already delivered to Ukraine, are they full operative at the moment, or the training is still ongoing? And about the range of artillery, I mean, these new weapons you got from NATO countries, is it longer than the range of the Russian army? So is it possible to attack them without being fired back? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Currently, indeed, we have been receiving material support and equipment to Ukraine, and those types of equipment, military equipment and weapons which we have received and for which personnel has been trained are already used to counteract the enemy. And as you rightly emphasized about the artillery, those models M777 provides us with some advantage with counter-artillery action against the enemy's artillery, and we can fire against their second line, their material reserves, their warehouses, their storage of ammunition and fuel and lubricants. So if we effect their logistical support, we understand that, you know, their tanks cannot move without fuel. And as I emphasized, one of the tasks of our artillery is fighting against their artillery. So taking fire advantage against the enemy. Thank you. Next question, and we will finish. I'm Viktor Melnikov, CGTN. I will add a bit the question asked by my colleague from Beijing. Is there any counter-offensive in Donbass and in Kharkiv Oblast, or is it planned? Thank you again for your question. We do carry out certain actions. Definitely we plan certain actions to regain control of Ukrainian territory. Let us say this, we are planning something, we are doing something. Let the enemy think what we are planning and where we are planning to do something. Thank you. I have the last question, which we often hear from journalists here in Ukraine Media Center at Ukrinform. When we ask our allies to help us, including help with weapons, can we emphasize again what are our needs? You mentioned new artillery of 155 millimeters, maybe some other items you would like to emphasize for our foreign partners when we are talking about support for our security. Those items which can be announced in public were already announced, first of all, by the President of Ukraine in his statement for the international community. They were mentioned by the Minister of Defense. All other items, we mentioned some categories. We said we need heavy weapons, we need anti-tank tools, anti-tank weapons. Now about details, we have those details, but we are not announced it. Well, it's not top state secret, but it's subject of diplomatic negotiations. And it's important to understand that any item that we mention may spoil the negotiations, because Russia would try and interfere, and we had some examples where some information about international assistance, about weapons assistance was announced, several contracts were broken. But about weapons already supplied, for you to understand, I have more than 10 pages in small prints. This is the table, a list of everything already supplied and already sent by the Minister of Defense to our armed forces. It includes artillery systems, it includes multiple launch rocket systems. I'm just mentioning categories, I cannot mention any details. It's about mortars, it's about artillery, it's about armored vehicles, it's about tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers. What else can be mentioned? Trucks, radars. There's a long list of everything which has already been provided, but you have to understand that, of course, we have our needs. We are not saying that everything we need to take it to get advantage, or at least to get to parity, we have already received it. No, we are not saying that. And speaking about Lend-Lease, it's planned, it has been planned for 3 years now, so it's planned that there will be some time to arm us with everything we need. So the main thing is that now all those processes have started. We have entered the period of time where there will be some regular support of military assistance to Ukraine. That's very important. Thank you. I'd like to thank our speakers, and I'd like to say that at this location, Ukraine Media Center to Confirm, we are planned for briefings in this format also for the future. The idea is to bring together people from various components of Ukrainian defense and security forces, to have their official representatives here, for us to provide comprehensive information across all range of questions. I'd like to ask thank our today's guests, Hanna Maliar, Deputy Minister of Defense, Oleksiy Hromov from General Staff from Armed Forces, Oleksiy Nadtochiy from National Guard of Ukraine, Leonid Baran from Administration of Border Protection and Sexual Service of Ukraine, and Oleksiy Serheyev from National Police of Ukraine. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this press conference. I'd like to thank journalists and with Ukraine.
Перелік посад.